When Brezhnev took over, he practiced what you might call de-Khrushchevnization. I guess that's the way to pronounce it. That word is in the book. Whereas Khrushchev had practiced de-Stalinization, Brezhnev said, I'm going to de-Khrushchev this place and undo all the reforms that Khrushchev had tried to make. He tried to control the society as the Russian people have always been controlled. Now, one man I really want to mention during this period was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn was a very popular writer, at least popular outside of the Soviet Union, and he wrote articles critical of the Soviet system and critical of communism in general, wrote books also. And for this, he was sent to Siberia, the way that the Soviet people often treat their dissenters. However, the outside world put so much pressure on the Soviet Union that Brezhnev finally allowed Solzhenitsyn to come to the United States. The Solzhenitsyn came to the United States and lived in New England, living largely in isolation because he wanted to write his books, and he had a loudspeaker system set at the end of his lane, leading to his house, telling any visitors to go away. I don't have time to talk to you. He finally, though, came out and attended a town meeting. He spent several years in the United States, and he said he'd always wondered why the people of the United States acted as they did and seemed so indifferent. Then he realized that the United States is so isolated from the events of Europe, so far away from the rest of the world. And he also noticed American young people were more interested in what's going on in tonight's football game than they are in politics, where their young people often are more interested in, can I find me a good job, than they are interested in what's going on in the Soviet Union. And he said the American people just don't seem to appreciate their rights and their freedoms and their privileges. They take them too much for granted. He finally went back to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and died there in Russia. And of course you might think, well, was he homesick for his homeland? That was part of it. It also said that he could not stand the Western decadence. He said he came to the United States expecting to find a Christian land, and instead he found a whole lot of pornography, a whole lot of smut on the TV, a whole lot of things that were not allowed in his native Soviet Union, that we in the United States just wallowed in that stuff. And he said he couldn't stand the decadence. And a lot of Russians who came over during this time period found the same thing. They just could not stand Western decadence. And a lot of them became discontented for the same reason. The newspapers, Pravda, now I'm not going to write that down, but Pravda was a typical, it said it was a state-controlled newspaper, and it's put out the Soviet propaganda. Avesta was their other supposedly, the word Pravda is a Russian word meaning truth, and Avesta meaning news. But there were persons who joked that there was no news in Pravda and no truth in Avesta. Be that as it may, in 1986, a terrible nuclear accident occurred in the town of Chernobyl, and you'll hear about Chernobyl from time to time. I've had more than one student do a paper on it. Nobody lives in Chernobyl today. When the accident occurred, the people in Chernobyl were told it wasn't so great, and all of a sudden they were told, just leave, get out of here, get out of here as quick as you can. Many persons died from the radiation, and for many years people died. The American doctors moved in, not to Chernobyl, but moved into the Soviet Union to try to treat some of the Soviet citizens who were affected by the radiation. You can now go into Chernobyl. Nobody can live there, but you can go in for maybe a few hours and bicycle around the place. Automobiles are not allowed in. And there you'll see cars. The cars now all have flat tires, but they're radioactive. Family pictures hanging on walls still, but are starting to wrinkle and decay. The roofs of the house are starting to leak badly, and some of the houses are starting to crumble for lack of use. The whole place is radioactive. It's expected to be anywhere from 600 to 900 years before anybody can live. What went wrong? Again, their sheer lack of expertise. All right, if you look at our nuclear facilities, we construct them in a building that resembles this. That way, if the place collapses, it's going to collapse on itself and protect the people from external remedies. It's designed to collapse on itself. Their building had no such structure, and the result was they finally decided they could throw a bunch of dirt on it, pile up dirt on it, which they did, and that supposedly contained the radiation from spreading any farther. Again, big disaster occurred in 1986. It was detected by foreign detection devices. The Russian people were told that, hey, the Westerners are exaggerating the seriousness of it. It's not all that bad. Yes? Chernobyl. That's Chernobyle. Chernobyl showed a lot of the lack of technical expertise that was true in Russia. In our country, we had one meltdown at 3 Mile Island, and nobody died as a result of the meltdown. But back in 1979, we did have a meltdown occur at 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Nobody had to evacuate. In fact, the only person who died from it was one family quickly fled to Baltimore, and their son drowned in a swimming pool accident at Baltimore. But again, that was not really directly as a result of the meltdown. In Chernobyl, hundreds of people died, and other hundreds had their lives cut short. The Russian people seemed to thrive under this kind of repression. To the Westerners, it might seem like repression, but to Russian people, thought of it as law and order. Their economy continued to not grow. While this was going on, their athletics were highly prized. Outstanding athletes were looked on, and they won some They won the 1960 Olympics, and they won some Olympic competitions throughout the years. They had an extremely good hockey team they thought was the best in the world until the Philadelphia Flyers beat them in a game. I believe the year was 1980. One of the biggest hockey games in all of history when our Philadelphia Flyers beat their all-star team. They did try their hand at basketball. No, they haven't done much with baseball, but they tried their hand at basketball. And again, the problem with their basketball players, I think, was that they cut their better ones along the way. And the ones who made it to the top in their country were just not quite as good as the ones who made it to the top in our country. Now, some of their better players made American pro teams. We had one played for the Hawks, Sasha Volkov. He was little more than a utility player on our team, but he was one of the best in their country. They had a problem with long, long bread lines. To get a loaf of bread or even a couple loaves of bread, they had to stand in long lines, sometimes 3 or 4 hours long, and line up because of extreme shortages. If you want a loaf of bread, you could go to any supermarket here and have a loaf of bread in a matter of minutes. For them, bread and milk were commodities that were really hard to come by. There's more said about Solzhenitsyn on page 797, and there's his name's also mentioned on page 795 about his being exiled, finally coming to the United States, not liking it here, and finally going back home. old people who dominated Russia were called a gerontocracy. These old men. Brezhnev died. Andropov, and his name is pronounced Andropov, succeeded him. Andropov only lasted about 2 years. Eventually, Gorbachev took over. Anyway, I'm going to jump ahead to the disintegration. I mean, your book talks a little bit about what life was like in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, but I'm going to jump to this disintegration. They finally got a youthful man who realized there had to be reforms made. But reform has always been dangerous in the Soviet Union. And under Gorbachev tried to change the Constitution, tried to give people more rights, more liberties. But instead of appreciating it, the people rebelled. Beginning with Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania. Now, Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania are 3 small countries on the Baltic. And they first announced their intention to withdraw from the Soviet Union. Gorbachev said, well, remain part of the Soviet Union, but we'll give you more rights and more privileges and let you be somewhat autonomous, let you speak your own language and have your own schools. They voted to completely break away from the Soviet Union. Gorbachev tried to tell them this vote was illegal. In the meantime, Gorbachev was vacationing, I believe, in the Crimea one day, like Khrushchev was, and he got word that he couldn't get his calls through to Moscow, which reminded him of what happened to Khrushchev. Couldn't get his calls back to Moscow, so they found a shortwave radio set that didn't work again, but they began tinkering with it and got it to work. And listening to shortwave radio, they learned that a coup had taken place back at the Kremlin, and Gorbachev was ousted. Well, the rest of the world did not recognize the ouster. In fact, the United States President George Bush says, hey, the Soviet Union has a constitution, so they have a legal means to get rid of them, a constitutional means. A coup is not going to be recognized, so the outside world refused to recognize the coup. Eventually, some of the Soviet people began to reject the coup also. They said, we don't want to go back to the old hard-line communism. And the coup was defeated after a short order, and Gorbachev was temporarily restored to power. However, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania left the Soviet Union. Then, all the 16 republics left. Georgia, Belarus, Armenia, and all the stands. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkestan, all of them left. I know I didn't name them all, but they began to form their own countries, and the Soviet Union breakup was complete. Gorbachev resigned, and and Russia became a separate state, the biggest state, but nevertheless, it was only a state. It was half as big as what it had been. Yeah, Boris Yeltsin took over. That was the name I couldn't think of, Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin took over after Gorbachev, and he was to govern Russia for a good many years. He had a problem with drinking, and he had ill health also. He was one of those older men. But Yeltsin ran Russia for a while. Gorbachev is still alive, but he no longer has any authority. So the Soviet Union had broken up, and it was a surprise to everyone. Well, as the Soviet Union broke up, the nations of Europe began to seek their independence also. Your book starts off talking about Poland. Poland formed a labor union called Solidarity. In 1980, Soviet troops moved in and broke up the Solidarity Union and said it was illegal. But the Polish Union continued to meet in secret anyway. 10 years later, in 1990, Polish Union Solidarity more or less took over the country, and they told Russia, go home and stay home. And the Russians went home. So Poland was now independent of communism. About the same time, other nations did the same thing. Czechoslovakia, well, if you talk about Hungary next. Hungary had revolted in 1956. And their revolt had been crushed, and their leader had been shot dead by Soviet troops. But in 1990, Hungary revolted again. This time, there were no Soviet troops to stop them. The Hungarian communist leader realized he didn't have a chance, and he stepped down. So Hungary sent the Russians home. Same thing for Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had been invaded by Russia in 1968, but in 1990 they told the Russians to go home, and this time there was no invasion. Now, Yugoslavia also had been communist up to this time. Yugoslavia was led by a man named Tito. A year ago, I had a student from what was once Yugoslavia in my class, and she said Tito was a remarkable man. Tito was able to keep the Muslims and Christians working together in some kind of harmony. Unfortunately, Tito did not last forever. When he died, Yugoslavia then splintered into several nations, among them Serbia, which had not been a nation since World War I. Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, all of them formed from what had once been Yugoslavia. Now, I want to say this about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia made the only automobile that ever sold in the United States. It was called the Yugo. I wonder, my other class can say, none of you have any of you ever heard of the Yugo?
Yes.
Okay, there was a popular song.
It was in a movie.
It was in a movie. It was a popular song, you know, by In My Yugo. The Yugo was one of the worst cars ever sold in the United States. And yet it was probably the best car that the communist world produced. But it was not up to American standards, but you know, they made a movie about the Yugo. But anyway, Yugoslavia broke up into several smaller countries, all of them declaring their independence from the Soviet Union.